The man who wore Dad's jersey. How do you lose an entire, glorious empire in a time frame that barely covers a standard summer vacation? The answer, friends, is simple. You try to win the Industrial Revolution using the sheer, unadulterated vibes of your magnificent, long-dead uncle. Welcome to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, a conflict so perfectly skewed in favor of cold, Prussian efficiency that it feels less like a historical event and more like a carefully crafted instructional video on how not to fight a war. Our leading man in this tragedy, dressed perpetually in the shadow of historical greatness, is Emperor Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, better known as Napoleon III. He was a man of great schemes and little achievements, which is a polite way of saying he was the historical equivalent of a cover band that only knew the guitar solos. His uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, had been the boogeyman of Europe. In 1805, at Austerlitz, Napoleon the Great had not only obliterated a combined Russo-Austrian army, but had delivered the coup de grace to the 1,000-year-old, frail, and thoroughly confused Holy Roman Empire. It took 7 coalitions and 23 years of continuous European effort to bring that revolutionary force down. Napoleon III, in contrast, managed to get his entire military machine permanently shelved in less than 50 days. He desperately wanted the legend. He got, instead, a spectacular, humiliating collapse engineered by a man whose facial hair alone suggested he wasn't here to make friends. That man was Otto von Bismarck, Minister-President of the Kingdom of Prussia. The master of the troll and the sick old man, Bismarck was not a romantic. He was a pragmatist. He didn't believe in the glory of the charge or the honor of the duel. He believed in Realpolitik, which translates roughly to, I will use any means necessary, including outright theatrical manipulation, to achieve my singular goal of unifying Germany. And if you get in the way, I shall have Moltke roll over you with a very heavy train. In 1866, Prussia had already humiliated Austria in the lightning-fast 7 Weeks' War. Europe realized that the old German Confederation, that toothless assembly of 39 states dominated by Catholic Austria, was obsolete. A new, muscular, Protestant, and deeply industrious North German Confederation was born, led by Prussia. This naturally made France nervous. Napoleon III, constantly trying to impress his cabinet and himself, demanded territorial concessions along the Rhine. This was Bismarck's cue. He smiled. This was precisely the external threat he needed to scare the independent, beer-sipping southern German states, Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, into his unified arms. A noisy, aggressive war with France was, in Bismarck's mind, the perfect wedding invitation. Meanwhile, Emperor Napoleon III was a wreck. He was 61, plagued by constant, excruciating agony from large gallstones, which the state kept secret. His empire, much like his bladder, was failing. He was hobbling around his palace, pale and drawn, trying to channel the energy of his magnificent uncle while suffering the relentless internal pain that made strategic thinking about as appealing as a trip to the dentist. His cabinet ministers, driven by nationalist fervor and the pervasive idea that the French army was still the finest in Europe, urged him on. Then came the casus belli, a diplomatic masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. The Hohenzollern Candidacy, when Spain offered its vacant throne to a German prince, Leopold of Hohenzollern, the French panicked. Encirclement, just like the bad old Habsburg days. French pressure forced the prince to withdraw. It should have been Napoleon III's finest diplomatic hour. He had won without firing a shot. But, fueled by pain and vanity, he overplayed his hand. He ordered his ambassador, Count Benedetti, to chase down the vacationing Prussian king Wilhelm I at the spa town of Ems and demand a personal, eternal guarantee that no Hohenzollern would ever seek the Spanish throne again. King Wilhelm I, a polite old gentleman who mostly just wanted to enjoy his mineral baths in peace, found this demand spectacularly insulting. He calmly told Benedetti that he couldn't guarantee eternity and that the matter was closed. He then sent a politely worded, slightly bored telegram to Bismarck detailing the encounter. Bismarck was dining with Moltke and Roon, his top generals. He read the king's detailed diplomatic wire. Then, he performed the greatest act of geopolitical trolling the 19th century had ever seen. He didn't lie. He merely creatively edited the text. The king's original wire was a long, courteous explanation of why he could not promise such a thing à tout jamais. Bismarck's published masterpiece, the infamous Ems Dispatch, read, "His Majesty the King refused to receive the French ambassador again and sent to tell him that His Majesty had nothing further to communicate to the ambassador." It was a diplomatic mic drop delivered via telegraph. The effect was immediate and seismic. The French press and public, already high on imperial vanity, were outraged at the icy insult delivered by the Prussian king. The German public, simultaneously, was furious at the arrogance of the French ambassador demanding eternal pledges. Bismarck's calculated rudeness went viral. The streets of Paris exploded with nationalist fervor. Crowds chanted, "À Berlin! À Berlin!" Napoleon III, weakened by illness and terrified of losing face to his political rivals, saw no choice. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Bismarck raised a triumphant glass of wine. The trap was sprung, and the southern German states, seeing France as the clear, obnoxious aggressor, immediately honored their secret treaties and threw their lot in with Prussia. So much for liberation. Number 1. A tale of two mobilizations. Clockwork versus calamity. The first act of any major war is mobilization. The frantic, complex business of taking hundreds of thousands of men, equipping them, and shipping them across the country to the precise spot they need to start shooting people. In Germany, mobilization was a symphony. General Helmuth von Moltke, the quiet, brilliant chief of the general staff, had planned this for years. He had detailed timetables for every unit, every road, and every railway car. When the order came, the German army moved like a Swiss clock. If that clock was 200,000 men wide and driven by the relentless power of steam. Over 1 million trained reservists were armed, organized, and dispatched to the border with chilling precision. They knew where they were going, and their supplies were waiting for them when they arrived. In France, mobilization was a chaotic, disorganized traffic accident involving several thousand supply wagons and a missing instruction manual. The French system was a professional army built on selective conscription. Wealthy men, and often anyone with a sensible degree of self-preservation, simply paid a poor replacement to fight for them. This left the army filled with grizzled veterans, yes, but also a massive influx of often illiterate, resentful men, commanded by a general staff riddled with political appointees and petty rivals. The mobilization plan relied on soldiers reporting to their local depots, collecting their gear, and then traveling to join their units, which were often assembling somewhere else entirely. The resulting chaos was immediate and spectacular. Soldiers showed up at train stations only to find no trains. Trains showed up at stations only to find no soldiers. Generals demanded equipment from supply dumps that were either empty or filled entirely with the wrong items. One depot famously reported having large quantities of canned goods but no can openers. In the crucial Eastern Corps, the commander of the 6th Corps wired Paris. "I have only brought half my regiment. I am missing the rest of my men, the divisional staff, my artillery, and almost all my supplies. The French cavalry, bless their shiny, useless hearts, showed up with their magnificent, polished breastplates and sabers, ready to conquer, only to discover that the railways had been prioritized for infantry, or that the wrong gauge of track had been used, or that the necessary engine driver had simply failed to show up. While the Germans deployed with the speed and chilling efficiency of an accountant submitting quarterly taxes, the French deployed with the grace and coordination of a flock of startled pigeons. The hardware. The Chassepot versus the Krupp. Despite the logistical farce, on the battlefield, the French still possessed some spectacular hardware. The French infantry carried the Chassepot rifle. This was a breech-loading bolt-action weapon that was arguably the finest infantry rifle in the world. It had a clever rubber seal that prevented gas leaks, giving it a phenomenal range of over 1,500 meters. Their German counterparts, the Dreyse needle rifle, were a decade older, leaky, and had an effective range of only 600 meters. In a straight rifle fight, the French would win every single time. They also had a terrifying, secret weapon, the Mitrailleuse. This was an early machine gun, a multi-barreled volley weapon that could spit 125 rounds a minute via a crank mechanism. It was a potential meat grinder, assuming the generals knew how to use it. Spoiler, they mostly didn't, treating it like a glorified, clumsy piece of artillery. The German ace, however, was the one that truly mattered. The Krupp steel breech-loading artillery. The French were still hauling around gorgeous bronze muzzle-loading cannons. They were heavy, slow to reload, and used unreliable timed fuses. They were, in short, 17th century notions of heroism applied to 19th century metal. The German Krupp guns were made of steel, not bronze, meaning they didn't explode when overworked. They loaded from the breech, meaning they reloaded faster. They used percussion fuses, meaning they exploded reliably on impact. Most critically, they outranged the French guns by several thousand meters. This meant that in any battle, the Germans could set up their artillery outside the effective range of the French guns, proceed to systematically dismantle every French position, and the French could literally do nothing but wait for the inevitable. As Napoleon I had once famously observed, God fights on the side with the best artillery. In 1870, God was clearly a meticulous Prussian bureaucrat with an investment in the Krupp steel foundry. The baptism of fire and PR. Napoleon III, hobbling from his gallstones, left Paris on July 28, 1870, to personally command the newly christened Army of the Rhine. He still believed his name alone could inspire victory. The initial action was less of a battle and more of an embarrassing public relations stunt. On August 2nd, the French Second Corps under General Charles Frossard attacked the small German border town of Saarbrücken. It was easily captured. Paris celebrated wildly. The French emperor reported back home that his 14-year-old son, the Prince Imperial, had received his baptism of fire and showed great coolness by watching the skirmish from a safe distance. This minor, pointless victory was the first and last time French troops set foot on German soil. It also confirmed Bismarck's narrative. France was the belligerent aggressor, and the southern states needed to hold fast to Prussia. The euphoria lasted approximately 48 hours. Napoleon III was stunned by reports of a massive German force, the Third Army, advancing across the border. This force, 40,000 strong, was heading toward the village of Wissembourg, defended by a single, isolated French division of 5,000 under General Abel Douay. The French fought with astounding bravery. Their Chassepots carved bloody swaths in the German ranks, and their Algerian Turcos fought like demons, but they were horribly outnumbered. When German artillery fire killed General Douay, the German guns closed in. The First French Corps surrendered. It was a clear pattern. Bravery, wasted by isolation and superior firepower. The medieval tactic versus the industrial age. In response to this shock, the emperor hurriedly entrusted Marshal Patrice MacMahon, a man known mostly for his magnificent bravery and his strategic competence being roughly equivalent to a broken spoon, to engage the Germans. MacMahon's 45,000 men marched to a ridgeline near the town of Wörth, taking up what they thought was a strong defensive position. The French, entrenched in the heavily wooded ridge, could fire down across open fields, perfect for the superior Chassepot. On August 6th, the Germans of the Third Army marched forward, fully prepared for a hard fight. And a hard fight they got. The French infantry, relying on their fantastic rifles, unleashed a torrent of fire. The German ranks were decimated. The Dreyse riflemen couldn't even reach the French positions. It looked, for a terrifying moment for the Germans, like the superior French infantry doctrine might actually win the day. But then, MacMahon made a crucial, fatal discovery. The Germans were not relying on infantry tactics. He looked across the field, over the heads of the struggling German infantry, and saw a shimmering line of smoke. The German artillery, hundreds of Krupp guns, was raining high-explosive steel shells onto his positions from a range the French bronze muzzle loaders couldn't even dream of reaching. The French gunners returned fire desperately, but their shells mostly fell short, landing harmlessly in the fields below, while the Krupp guns systematically, accurately, and relentlessly blew the French defensive positions and the French batteries to pieces. The French artillery command radioed MacMahon. "We are entirely outclassed. We cannot compete." MacMahon, seeing his men being pounded into oblivion, decided that the correct response to being outclassed by industrial science was to double down on glorious, old-fashioned, cinematic heroism. He ordered the charge. Enter the cuirassiers. These were the historical poster boys of French military glory. Clad in shining steel breastplates, wielding magnificent sabers, their very presence was meant to strike terror into the enemy. They were the embodiment of Napoleonic swagger, and they were about to gallop headlong into the modern age. MacMahon ordered thousands of these beautiful, impractical figures to charge down the ridge, straight into the massed fire of German infantry, armed with rifles that shot 4 times faster than anything Napoleon I had ever faced, backed by precision steel artillery. It was a beautiful, spectacular, and utterly suicidal sight. The cuirassiers thundered down the slope, the sunlight glinting off their breastplates. They were magnificent targets. The German infantry, who had spent years practicing firing drills, not dodging ornate horses, simply braced and opened fire. The sheer volume of lead and shrapnel was horrifying. The first wave of horses and riders hit the ground, a grotesque tangle of steel, flesh, and broken lances. The breastplates, which offered reasonable protection against a medieval arrow or sword, offered precisely 0 protection against a 19th century rifle round. They merely added weight and made the men easier to spot. One German officer, watching the carnage, reportedly remarked with a professional sigh, "They are performing magnificent theater, but they seem to have forgotten the plot involves winning." Wave after wave, the French cavalry charged. They broke a few German lines, causing momentary panic, only to be immediately enveloped and destroyed by rapid-fire infantry and, inevitably, the systematic intervention of the omnipresent Krupp artillery, which adjusted its elevation and began raining shells directly into the charging ranks. It was a medieval tactic against an industrial age enemy. By the end of the day, MacMahon's army was shattered, having suffered nearly 20,000 casualties. The field was littered with shiny, broken breastplates. The army of the Rhine was in full, ignominious flight. the baffling retreat to the Cauldron, while MacMahon was busy turning his cavalry into expensive dog food at Wörth. General Frossard, the victor of the Saarbrücken PR stunt, was being surrounded at Spicheren. The Germans, employing new, flexible infantry tactics devised by Moltke, small platoons probing from multiple directions, found every weak spot in the French defensive line. The French, who relied on tight formations for massed Chassepot fire, found that these tight formations were ideal targets for both encirclement and, of course, the relentless Krupp shells. Frossard, increasingly frantic, tried to communicate with his superior, Marshal François Achille Bazaine. But communication was abysmal, and Bazaine was suffering from a crippling attack of strategic indecision. By evening, Frossard was forced to order a withdrawal. When news of the twin disasters, Wörth and Spicheren, reached the increasingly agonized Napoleon III, he was shell-shocked. His glorious invasion plan was dead. He ordered the army of the Rhine to retreat to the massive, impregnable fortress of Metz. It was here that Napoleon III made perhaps the single most destructive decision of the war. Unable to command due to constant, excruciating gallstone attacks, he relinquished command of his remaining forces to Marshal Bazaine. Bazaine was brave, yes, but he was also a monument to dithering. His primary motivation seemed to be avoiding doing anything that might require him to make a firm decision. The great French army, over 130,000 men strong, began its retreat toward Metz. The journey should have taken 2 days. Thanks to Bazaine's dithering, arguing with staff and general strategic paralysis, it took over a week just to cross the river Moselle. The French army was retreating slower than the Germans had calculated, allowing Moltke's well-oiled machine to catch up. On August 16th, a single Prussian corps of 30,000 men under General von Alvensleben, sent merely to harass the French rearguard near the village of Mars-la-Tour, stumbled directly into the entire dawdling French army of the Rhine. The Germans were outnumbered almost 4 to 1. This should have been the moment of decisive French victory, a historical reversal where they crushed the single, isolated corps. Instead, it became a perfect demonstration of French dysfunction. Bazaine, demonstrating his personal valor, threw himself into the chaotic center of the fighting. This was excellent for his personal legend, but absolutely catastrophic for the chain of command, as it completely isolated him from the rest of the battle. His other officers, terrified of making a mistake without explicit orders, mostly did nothing. The vastly outnumbered Germans, sensing the enemy chaos, took the offensive. This led to another glorious, suicidal, but this time German, moment of military insanity. Von Bredow's death ride. 2 heavy German cavalry regiments, 800 horsemen, were ordered to charge the French artillery line. They galloped headlong into a wall of French fire and were utterly decimated, losing half their men. But they succeeded, momentarily silencing the French guns and buying time. The French infantry, left unsupported and confused by the lack of orders from Bazaine, failed to break the thin German line. By late afternoon, German reinforcements, moving with that relentless clockwork Moltke precision, began to flow into the area. Bazaine, staring at the chaos, made the horrible realization that he had wasted his overwhelming advantage and now couldn't break out. He ordered a retreat back to Metz. Moltke smiled again. His trap was working beautifully. The siege of indecision. 2 days later, on August 18th, the full force of the German 1st and 2nd armies advanced toward the French positions near Gravelotte. The French, still trusting in their superior rifles and defensive lines, dug in. Once again, the Chassepot proved deadly. The elite Prussian guard, ordered into a suicidal frontal assault at Privat, was massacred, losing thousands of men in minutes. It was Wörth all over again, but with Prussian guardsmen instead of cuirassiers. But, as always, Prussia dominated the artillery duel. Over 200 Krupp guns were brought to bear. They systematically laid waste to the French positions, forcing a mass rout at Saint-Privat. French General Charles Bourbaki led the famed elite Imperial Guard, the crème de la crème of French soldiery, to reinforce the line. But upon seeing the sheer terror in the eyes of his allies fleeing the field, Bourbaki halted the advance. He reportedly protested to his superior in a moment of pure, understandable exhaustion. "You promised me victory. Now you get me involved in a rout." When the rest of the French army saw the elite Imperial Guard, their last hope, preparing to withdraw, their already threadbare morale completely collapsed. The entire army retreated in disarray behind the massive, impressive, and now utterly pointless fortifications of Metz. On August 19th, the Germans finished their encirclement. The Sedan and his entire main professional army were promptly besieged. Moltke, having bottled up 133,000 of France's finest professional soldiers, removed a highly competent but tactically aggressive General Steinmetz from command for making a few blunders at Gravelotte, a level of casual, professional ruthlessness unthinkable in the rival-riddled French army, and turned his attention to the only remaining French force in the field. That force was the newly constituted Army of Chalon, under Marshal MacMahon, who was trying desperately to rally his exhausted, demoralized troops. The centerpiece of the French Empire, the Emperor himself, was forced to tag along. A gravely ill, agonized shadow commanding nothing but his own suffering. His condition, the constant, grinding pain of his gallstones, was now a physical manifestation of the Empire's core rot. The selective conscription system, which exempted anyone with money, had left the ranks filled with the dregs of society, commanded by aging or politically convenient officers. MacMahon, realizing that the survival of the Empire depended on relieving Bazaine at Metz, drove his 120,000 demoralized men on a desperate march starting on August 21st. He attempted to march along a northern course, trying to avoid contact with the Prussians. It was an exercise in futility. MacMahon's force was quickly spotted and shadowed by German cavalry patrols, who reported the location of every single French column straight back to Moltke. Moltke received the updates and, according to legend, merely smiled his icy academic smile. He ordered his armies, a combined force of 200,000 men, to abandon their march on Paris and execute a massive wheeling movement north. Their mission: catch the much smaller French force in a huge pincer. When MacMahon finally realized he was being pursued, outmaneuvered, and was about to be trapped, he deployed his men in what he hoped was a defensive triangle, near the obsolete 17th century fortress of Sedan. He placed his army with the River Meuse and the fortifications directly at his back. It was a tactical nightmare, a defensive position that guaranteed annihilation. One of his subordinates, General Auguste Alexandre Ducrot, surveyed the scene with a profound sense of despair and delivered a quote that perfectly encapsulated the French situation. Marrying high drama with base biological realism, nous sommes dans un pot de chambre, et nous y serons emmerdés. The stage was set for the final, humiliating act of the Second French Empire. The finest infantry, the bravest cavalry, the most magnificent breastplates, all trapped in a small valley, awaiting the arrival of science, logistics, and an unforgiving volume of Krupp steel. How would France's remaining forces attempt to escape Moltke's steel trap? And would the Emperor finally find the glorious death he so desperately craved to justify his failure? Find out in the next episode of our tragic, yet hilarious, journey through the Franco-Prussian War.